Ethan lost a $200,000 deal. Not because he wasn't prepared. Not because his pitch was weak. He was prepared. He was sharp. He knew every number, every slide, every answer. He lost it because he never saw it coming. The client had checked out 12 minutes in, arms crossed, leaning back, eyes drifting to the window. And Ethan kept talking, confident, energetic, completely unaware, right up until the moment they said, "We'll be in touch." They never were. That night he called me. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even upset. He was just quiet. And honestly, that silence scared me more than any frustration would have. I've been there. You've probably been there too. Said the right things at the wrong moment. Read someone completely wrong. Walked away thinking it went fine, only to find out later it didn't. This video is about changing that. 8 chapters, 8 principles. One skill that changes everything. Stay with me. Let me ask you something. Think about the last conversation that didn't go the way you wanted. A meeting, a tough talk with someone you care about. A moment where you said all the right words and still lost the room. Now ask yourself, were you really seeing the other person, or were you just talking at them? Most of us spend our whole lives talking. Very little of that time is spent actually seeing. Seeing what someone needs, seeing what they fear, seeing what they're really saying when their mouth is moving, but their energy is somewhere else entirely. That's not a talent problem. That's not an intelligence problem. It's a skill problem, and skills can be learned. I've known Ethan for over 15 years. He's one of the most driven people I've ever met. Reads constantly. Works harder than almost anyone in his office. Has the kind of work ethic that makes you feel slightly guilty for sleeping 8 hours. But for years, and I mean years, things kept not working out the way they should have. Deals that should have closed didn't. Conversations that should have brought people closer pushed them away instead. Opportunities that seemed certain somehow slipped through his hands. And the frustrating part, he couldn't figure out why. Neither could I. Not at first. It wasn't until that night, after the $200,000 deal, that we sat down and really talked. Not about the pitch, not about the numbers, about people, about how little either of us actually understood them, and that conversation changed something for both of us. Here's what I've come to believe, and what this entire video is built around. Most people think understanding others is a gift. Something you either have or you don't. You're either naturally good at reading people, or you're not. That's not true. Understanding people is a skill. It's a practice. It's something you build, conversation by conversation, moment by moment, when you decide to pay attention in a different way, not with suspicion, not with judgment, with curiosity, with patience, with genuine respect for the fact that every person in front of you is carrying a world you can't fully see. That's the foundation of everything we're going to talk about today. In the next 60 minutes, we're going through 8 principles that changed how Ethan moves through the world, and how I do too. Each chapter is a skill. Each skill is practical. Each one comes with a real story. The kind of story that could happen to anyone, in any office, in any relationship, in any city across America. No theory for theory's sake. No empty motivation. Just 8 honest lessons about what it really means to understand another human being, and how that understanding can quietly change everything. Chapter 1 is about the thing most people completely ignore in every conversation they have. It's not what people say, it's what their body says before a single word ever leaves their mouth. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Decode the body. Before the words, there's something Ethan told me after he finally figured out what went wrong that day. He said he went back and watched the recording of that meeting. His company recorded all their client calls, standard practice. And he watched it back, not to fix his pitch, not to analyze his slides, just to watch the people across the table. What he saw made him go quiet for a long time. 12 minutes in, the lead client crossed her arms. Not aggressively, just quietly, like someone pulling a door halfway closed. 2 minutes after that, her colleague leaned back in his chair, just slightly, just an inch or two, but enough. And then, at the 14-minute mark, the second client glanced at his watch. Ethan on the screen kept going, energetic, confident, completely unaware. He told me, "Daniel, I was talking to people who had already left the room, and I didn't even know it. The body doesn't wait for permission to tell the truth, it just does. Most of us were never taught to listen to it. We were taught to listen to words, to pay attention to what people say, how they phrase things, what they agree or disagree with out loud. And words matter. Don't get me wrong, but words are the edited version. Words go through a filter. Words are chosen, shaped, softened, rehearsed. The body skips all of that. When someone is uncomfortable, their shoulders tighten. When someone disagrees but doesn't want to say so, they go still. Not relaxed still, but held still, like they're keeping something in. When someone has mentally checked out of a conversation, their feet of all things, will point toward the nearest exit. Not because they planned it, because the body moves toward where the mind already is. This isn't about becoming suspicious of everyone you talk to. It's about becoming more awake, more present, more honest with yourself about what's actually happening in the space between you and another person. Think about a conversation you've had recently. A meeting, a dinner, a phone call where something felt slightly off. You couldn't put your finger on it. The words seemed fine, but something in you noticed, a hesitation, a shift in energy, a smile that arrived a half-second too late. That feeling you had? That was your instinct picking up on body language your conscious mind hadn't processed yet. The skill isn't learning to manufacture that feeling. The skill is learning to trust it, and then learning what to look for so you can see it clearly, not just sense it vaguely. Here's what Ethan started paying attention to after that night. Crossed arms don't always mean someone is closed off or angry. Sometimes people cross their arms when they're cold. Sometimes it's just habit. Context matters. But crossed arms combined with a lean backward, combined with reduced eye contact, that's a pattern. And patterns are what you're looking for. Not isolated signals, but clusters of signals that tell a consistent story. A genuine smile reaches the eyes. You've heard this before, maybe, but sit with it for a moment. Think about the last time someone smiled at you and something felt slightly hollow about it. The mouth moved, the eyes didn't. That's not a small thing. That's someone being polite when they feel something else entirely. When someone nods quickly, rapid, short nods, it usually doesn't mean they agree. It means they want you to finish. There's a difference between the slow nod of someone genuinely absorbing what you're saying and the fast nod of someone waiting for their turn to speak, or waiting for the conversation to be over. And then there's mirroring. The natural kind, the kind that happens without thinking. When two people are genuinely connected in a conversation, their bodies sync up. They lean the same direction. They match each other's pace. When that mirroring stops, when one person's posture suddenly diverges from the others, something has shifted. Pay attention to that moment. Reading body language is not about catching people. It's about meeting them where they actually are. That's a different intention entirely. And the intention matters. Ethan didn't learn this to gain an edge over his clients. He learned it because he was tired of having conversations where he thought he was connecting and wasn't. He was tired of walking away from important moments, moments that mattered, without ever really knowing what the other person was experiencing. When you start seeing the body, something changes in how you show up. You slow down, you check in, you stop assuming that silence means agreement or that a smile means everything is fine. You become, in the truest sense of the word, more present, and presence, real presence, is something people feel. They might not be able to name it, but they feel it. Here's what to practice starting today. In your next conversation, any conversation, it doesn't have to be high stakes. Give yourself one job, not to talk well, not to make your points clearly, just to observe. Watch the posture. Notice the eyes. Pay attention to what the hands do when the person is speaking about something they care about versus something they don't. Don't analyze. Don't judge, just watch. You'll be surprised how much has always been there, waiting to be seen. The body speaks first. Learn to listen. And once you hear it, really hear it, you'll never be able to unhear it. Which brings us to something even more interesting. Because once you learn to see past what people show you with their body, the next step is learning to see past what they show you with their entire personality. Most people you meet are wearing something, not clothes, something deeper than that. Chapter 2 is about learning to see it. Chapter 2. See the mask, not the face. Ethan had a colleague at his office, a guy named Brett. Always the first one to volunteer, always smiling, always no problem, happy to help. The kind of person you'd describe as easygoing, low maintenance, genuinely pleasant to be around. Then one Tuesday morning, Brett didn't show up. No call, no email, just gone. His resignation letter was sitting in HR's inbox when they opened at 9. 2 paragraphs. Professional. And at the very end, one sentence that nobody saw coming. I've felt invisible here for 2 years. Ethan told me he sat with that sentence for a long time. 2 years. Every morning, Brett had walked through those doors, smiled, said no problem, helped everyone around him. And underneath all of it had been quietly disappearing. And not one person in that office, including Ethan, had noticed. Everyone is performing. The question is whether you're watching the performance or the performer. Here's something worth understanding about human beings. We are, all of us, wearing something in public. Not because we're dishonest, not because we're manipulative, but because showing the full, unfiltered version of ourselves to the world feels, for most people, genuinely unsafe. So we learn, usually very early in life, how to present, how to package ourselves in a way that feels acceptable, likable, professional, easy to be around. We learn which parts of us get a warm response and which parts make people uncomfortable. And over time, those presentations become second nature. So natural that sometimes we forget we're doing it. The mask isn't a lie, it's armor, and most people are wearing it for a very good reason. The problem is when we mistake the armor for the person, when we respond to the performance without ever wondering about the performer. Think about the people in your life who seem the most put together. The colleague who always has it figured out. The friend who never seems to struggle. The family member who brushes off every hard question with a joke. Now ask yourself honestly, how much of that do you actually believe? And how much of it have you just accepted because it was easier not to ask? Brett's mask was cheerfulness. Other people's masks are confidence, busyness, humor, indifference, anger, because anger is a much more comfortable thing to show the world than vulnerability. The masks are different. The reason behind them is almost always the same. Safety. So how do you see past it? Not by ripping it off. Never that. The moment you make someone feel exposed, you've lost them entirely. You see past the mask by making it unnecessary. By creating enough safety, enough genuine warmth in the space between you, that the person in front of you slowly, on their own terms, starts to let it down. There are a few things worth paying attention to. Watch for the gap between energy and expression. Someone who is enthusiastically agreeable in words, but physically still, slightly withdrawn. That gap is telling you something. Real enthusiasm takes up space. It leans in. It moves. When the words are big, but the body is small, something isn't adding up. Listen for what gets deflected. Every time you ask someone something real, something that touches on how they're actually doing, what they actually think, what they actually want, and they pivot away with humor or a vague answer, or by turning the question back to you, notice that. Not as a red flag, just as information. There's something there they're not ready to share yet. Pay attention to the moments right after the performance ends. When someone finishes a presentation and the room starts chatting. When a dinner wraps up and people start putting on their coats. When the formality of a situation lifts, even briefly. Those in-between moments are when the mask slips, not dramatically, just a little. A sigh, a different quality of stillness, a look that passes across someone's face before they compose themselves again. You don't need to see everything. You just need to stay curious long enough to see something real. After Brett left, Ethan made a decision. He started asking one question past the surface in every conversation he had. Not, "How are you?" because almost nobody answers that honestly. Something slightly more specific. "What's been on your mind this week?" Or simply, after someone said they were fine, "Yeah, what kind of fine?" Small questions, but they open something. Not always, not with everyone, but often enough. Because here's what most people are hungry for, underneath whatever mask they're wearing: to be asked. To be genuinely asked by someone who actually wants to hear the answer. That's it. That's the whole thing. You don't need a psychology degree. You don't need to analyze anyone. You just need to be someone who asks one more question and then, this is the important part, actually listens to the answer. When you do that consistently, something shifts. People start showing up differently around you. Not because you've unlocked some secret technique, but because genuine curiosity is rare. And when someone encounters it, real, unhurried, unjudging curiosity, they remember it. They come back to it. Everyone performs. Read the script. But more than that, be the person who makes the performance feel unnecessary. Be the person someone can exhale around. That's not a communication skill. That's a human one. And it leads us directly into something that Brett's story quietly points toward. Because once you learn to see the mask, the next question naturally becomes, why is it there? What is the person underneath actually trying to protect? Every behavior has a reason. Every action is pointing at something deeper. Chapter 3. Find the need behind. Every action. There was a period, Ethan told me this maybe a year into everything shifting for him, where he had a genuinely difficult relationship with his manager, a man named Richard. Richard had a habit that drove the entire team quietly crazy. In team meetings, he would correct people. Not privately, not after the fact, but right there in the room, in front of everyone. Mid-sentence, sometimes. A wrong figure, an imprecise word, a slightly off interpretation, and Richard would stop the conversation, redirect it, and move on as if nothing had happened. People flinched when he did it. Ethan flinched. And for a long time, Ethan's interpretation was the same as everyone else's. Richard was controlling. Richard was condescending. Richard, frankly, had a problem. Then one afternoon, Ethan stayed late. Richard was still there. And somehow, the way these things sometimes happen, they ended up talking. Not about work, just talking. And Richard mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd grown up the youngest of 4 brothers. That nothing he ever did was taken seriously until he could prove it was correct. That being precise, being exactly right, had been the only way he'd ever managed to get a seat at the table. Ethan drove home that night thinking about a completely different person than the one he'd been frustrated with for months. When you understand why someone does what they do, it becomes almost impossible to keep seeing them the same way. That's not a small thing. That's everything. Here's a truth about human behavior that took me a long time to really absorb. Nobody, and I mean nobody, does things for no reason. Every behavior, no matter how baffling or frustrating or hurtful it looks from the outside, is pointing at something underneath. A need that isn't being met. A fear that's running quietly in the background. A wound that never quite closed. The behavior is what you can see. The need is what's actually driving it. Psychologists have spent decades studying what human beings fundamentally need. And when you strip away all the complexity, it comes down to a handful of things that almost every person on Earth is trying, in their own way, through their own particular behaviors, to get. People need to feel safe. Not just physically, emotionally. They need to know that the ground beneath them isn't going to shift without warning. People need to feel seen, acknowledged. Like what they do and who they are actually registers with the people around them. People need to feel connected, to belong somewhere, to matter to someone. People need to feel some degree of control over their own lives. When that control feels threatened, the response is almost always to try to reclaim it, sometimes in ways that look from the outside like rigidity or aggression or stubbornness. And people need to feel like their life means something, like they're part of something larger than just getting through the day. Richard's public corrections weren't about the team. They were about control and recognition. Two things he'd spent his whole life fighting to earn. That doesn't make the behavior acceptable. Ethan never pretended it did. But understanding it changed something fundamental about how he responded to it. Instead of bracing for the next correction, he started doing something small. When he had a report to present, he'd run the key numbers by Richard beforehand. Informally. Just a quick check. Hey, wanted to make sure I had this right before the meeting. Richard would look it over, occasionally catch something, and here's the part that matters. He almost never interrupted Ethan's presentations after that. The need got met in a different way. The behavior changed. Ethan didn't do this manipulatively. He did it because he genuinely understood for the first time what Richard actually needed. And when you understand what someone needs, finding a way to work with it rather than against it stops feeling like a compromise and starts feeling like common sense. The most exhausting thing in the world is fighting a behavior without understanding what's feeding it. Think about someone in your life right now who frustrates you. A co-worker who constantly needs reassurance. A friend who always has to be right. A family member who withdraws the moment things get emotionally difficult. A partner who gets defensive before you've even finished the sentence. Now ask yourself, not what are they doing, but what do they need? The co-worker who needs reassurance is probably running on a background fear that they're not good enough, and one day everyone will figure it out. The friend who always has to be right might be someone whose intelligence was the only thing that ever made them feel valued. The person who withdraws when things get hard was likely taught somewhere along the way that emotions were dangerous things to show. This isn't about excusing anyone. Behavior still has consequences. People are still responsible for what they do. But understanding the need behind the behavior gives you something that frustration never will. It gives you options. It gives you patience. It gives you a way to respond that actually has a chance of changing something, rather than just adding more heat to an already uncomfortable situation. There's something else worth saying here, and it's something Ethan came back to more than once when we talked about this. When you start looking for the need behind people's behavior, you'll inevitably start doing the same thing with yourself. You'll catch yourself in a moment of irritation or anxiety or unusual silence, and you'll find yourself asking, okay, what's actually going on here? What do I need right now that I'm not acknowledging? That self-awareness is not a side effect of this skill. It might be the most valuable part of it. Behavior is the surface. Need is the root. You can spend a lifetime managing surfaces, or you can learn to work with roots. The people who truly understand others. The ones who seem to navigate every room, every relationship, every difficult conversation with a kind of quiet ease. They're almost always working at the root level. Not because they're smarter, because they're asking a different question. Not what is this person doing, but why? And once you start asking why consistently, you start noticing something else. People don't just have needs driving their behavior. They have specific moments, specific words, specific situations that light them up in ways that have nothing to do with what's happening right now. Those moments have a name. Chapter 4. Identify emotional triggers. Ethan has a friend, known him since college, a guy named Cole. Steady, calm, the kind of person who can sit through almost anything without losing his composure. You'd describe him as unshakable if you met him at a party. Genuinely one of the most even-keeled people Ethan had ever known. Except for one thing. Anytime someone said the words, "You should have known better," it didn't matter the context, didn't matter the tone, didn't matter whether it was directed at him or someone else entirely. Cole would go somewhere else. Not angry, not loud, just gone. A wall came down, quiet and total, and he'd be unreachable for the rest of the conversation. Ethan noticed it a few times before he said anything, and when he finally asked gently, Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said that growing up, those were the exact words his father used every single time Cole made a mistake. Every time, without exception. Not, let's figure out what happened. Not, what can we do differently. Just, you should have known better. Said in a tone that made it clear the conversation was over and the verdict was already in. Cole was 34 years old. His father had been gone for 6 years. And 5 words, in the right sequence, could still take him back to being 12. Triggers are not about the present moment. They never were. They are about a past experience that left a mark deep enough that certain things, certain words, certain tones, certain situations can reach back through time and pull that experience forward into right now. This is important to understand because triggers can look, from the outside, completely disproportionate. Someone reacts bigger than the situation seems to call for. They go cold when nothing obviously cold was said. They get defensive about something that wasn't even an accusation. And if you don't understand what a trigger is, your instinct is to take it personally. To think you did something wrong, or worse, to think there's something wrong with them. Neither of those things is usually true. What's true is that you accidentally touched something old, something that was already there long before you arrived. Now here's where this gets practical. And this is the part most people skip because it requires a kind of honesty that isn't always comfortable. Before you can reliably recognize other people's triggers, you need to know your own. Think about the moments in your life where you've reacted bigger than the situation warranted. A comment that shouldn't have stung as much as it did. A tone of voice that immediately put you on edge. A situation where you felt a flash of something. Anger, shame, defensiveness. That particular kind of hurt that goes deeper than the surface. And even as you were feeling it, some part of you knew the reaction was larger than what was in front of you. Those reactions are information. They're pointing at something. And when you take the time to understand what they're pointing at, 2 things happen. You become less likely to be blindsided by your own responses in moments that matter. And you become significantly more patient with other people's responses because you know, from the inside, how it feels to be pulled backward without warning. There's a quality that the best communicators share. The ones who seem to navigate conflict and tension and difficult personalities with a kind of quiet steadiness. That quality isn't the absence of emotion. It's not that they don't feel things. It's that they've done enough of their own work that they can usually tell the difference between what's happening now and what their history is adding to it. That distinction between present reality and past echo is one of the most valuable things a person can learn to make. So what do you actually look for in other people? Watch for reactions that seem out of proportion to the moment. Not as a judgment, just as a signal when someone's response doesn't quite match the situation. Get curious instead of defensive. Ask yourself what might be underneath it. Notice patterns. If the same person keeps having the same kind of reaction in the same kind of situation, that's not a coincidence. That's a map. It's showing you something consistent about what that person carries. Pay attention to the topics people consistently avoid. The things they redirect away from. The questions that get answered with a joke or a subject change. Avoidance is a trigger too, just a quieter one. Instead of flaring up, it goes still and steps around. And when you do happen to accidentally hit someone's trigger, because it will happen, it happens to everyone. Resist the instinct to defend yourself immediately. Just slow down. Give the moment some room. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is simply, "I didn't mean it that way. Are you okay?" Not as a script, as a genuine question. When you meet someone's trigger with curiosity instead of reaction, you change the entire shape of what happens next. Ethan started doing this with Cole after that conversation. Not walking on eggshells. He was clear about that. Just being aware. Choosing his words a little more carefully in certain moments. And when he noticed Cole going somewhere else, not pushing, just waiting, leaving the door open. Cole noticed. He didn't say anything directly. That's not really how Cole communicates. But something relaxed between them. Something that had always been slightly careful became slightly more easy. That's what this kind of awareness makes possible. Not perfect relationships, not conflict-free conversations, just more room, more ease. A little more of the grace that every single one of us, if we're honest, is hoping someone will extend to us. Because every person you will ever meet is carrying something you cannot see. Every single one. And most of them are doing the best they can with what they've got. Find the trigger. Understand the person. And when you understand the person, really understand them, something in you naturally becomes gentler, not weaker. Gentler. There's a difference, and it matters. Chapter 5. Trust your instincts. When something feels off. Ethan met a potential business partner at a networking event in downtown Chicago. Sharp dresser, confident handshake, the kind of person who fills a room without seeming to try. They talked for 20 minutes, and by the end of it, the guy, his name was Kevin, had Ethan genuinely excited about a potential collaboration. They met 3 more times over the following month. Kevin always had the right answers, always knew exactly what to say. Every concern Ethan raised got addressed immediately, smoothly, completely. No hesitation. No, let me think about that. Just answers, arriving fully formed, one after another. And somewhere around the 3rd meeting, Ethan noticed something he couldn't quite name. He drove home and called me. He said, "Daniel, everything this guy says makes sense. Every single thing checks out on the surface. But something feels wrong, and I don't know what it is." I asked him what specifically felt off. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He never doesn't know something. Nobody knows everything. But this guy, every question, every concern, he just has it. Perfectly. Every time." That was it. That was the thing. When everything sounds too perfect, that's not a green light. That's a signal to slow down. Truth, real truth, has a particular texture to it. It has pauses. It has moments of, "I'm not sure," and "let me get back to you on that." And honestly, I don't know the answer to that one. Real conviction has uncertainty woven through it. Because real knowledge comes from real experience. And real experience includes the parts that didn't go smoothly. When something is rehearsed, when someone has constructed a version of events rather than simply lived them, the uncertainty disappears. Everything becomes too clean, too ready, too perfectly fitted to whatever the moment requires. This is what Ethan was picking up on without being able to articulate it. Not a lie, exactly. Not something he could point to and say, "There, that's the problem." Just a texture that was wrong, a smoothness that real things don't usually have. We're not talking here about becoming paranoid, about treating every confident person as a suspect or approaching every relationship with suspicion. That's not what this is. Most people, most of the time, are exactly what they appear to be. But your instincts exist for a reason. They are the accumulated product of every interaction you have ever had. Every conversation, every face, every moment where something was off or something was genuine. Your nervous system has been quietly cataloging all of it, building a database you never consciously access, but that is always running in the background. When something triggers that database, when a pattern gets recognized that your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet, it sends a signal. That signal is what people call a gut feeling, and far too many people have learned to dismiss it. They dismiss it because they can't explain it rationally, because the other person hasn't done anything they can specifically point to, because they don't want to seem unfair or judgmental, because the easiest thing, socially, is to take things at face value and move on. But the instinct knows something, and learning to listen to it, not to act on it blindly, not to make accusations, but to simply let it inform how carefully you proceed, is one of the most important things you can develop. So how do you tell the difference between a genuine instinct and ordinary anxiety or unfair bias? It's a fair question, and it matters. Anxiety tends to be general. It attaches itself to situations, to types of people, to categories of experience. If you find yourself uncomfortable with everyone in a particular kind of setting, every job interview, every first date, every networking event, that's probably anxiety talking, not instinct. Instinct tends to be specific. It fires about this person, in this moment, for reasons you can't fully articulate, but that feel oddly precise. It's not, "I'm nervous." It's something about this specific situation doesn't add up. When you feel that specific, quiet wrongness, here's what to do. Ask a question they didn't prepare for. Not an aggressive question, not an accusatory one. Just something small and unexpected that takes the conversation slightly off the prepared script. Watch what happens in the half-second before they answer. That half-second is where the real information lives. Prepared answers arrive instantly. Genuine ones need a moment to form. Notice consistency over time. One conversation proves very little. But across multiple interactions, across different contexts, across moments when their guard is slightly lower, does the story stay the same? Do the details hold? Does the person you see when things are easy match the person you see when things get slightly complicated? Pay attention to how they talk about other people. Specifically, how they talk about people who are no longer useful to them. The way someone speaks about past partners, former colleagues, old friends who drifted away, that tells you something real about the values running underneath the surface presentation. And trust the slow reveal. Genuine people become more themselves over time. The details get richer, the edges get softer. They show you their contradictions and their doubts because that's what real human beings are made of. People who are performing a version of themselves tend to stay strangely consistent because consistency is easier to maintain than authenticity. Ethan didn't move forward with Kevin, not dramatically. He didn't confront him, didn't accuse him of anything. He just slowed down, asked a few questions that weren't in the script. And in the gaps between Kevin's answers, he found enough inconsistency to quietly, politely let the collaboration dissolve on its own. 6 months later, he heard from someone else in his industry that Kevin had left 2 other business partners in difficult situations. Nothing criminal, just not what he'd presented himself to be. Ethan never felt good about being right. That's not the point of this. The point is that he trusted something real in himself, acted on it calmly and without drama, and protected something that mattered. Your instincts are not your enemy. They are your oldest and most honest advisor. The problem is, we live in a world that constantly tells us to override them, to be polite, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to not judge. And most of the time, those are good instincts too, because most people deserve that grace. But grace and naivety are not the same thing. You can extend goodwill to someone while still paying attention. You can be warm and open and curious about people while also trusting the quiet voice that occasionally says, "Slow down. Look more carefully. Something here isn't quite right." That voice is not cynicism, it's wisdom. And the difference between the two is worth knowing. Truth has a rhythm. Learn to hear it. Because once you can hear when something is off, you gain something equally valuable on the other side. The ability to recognize when something is genuinely, undeniably to right. When a person is real. When a connection is solid. When trust is actually earned rather than just performed. And that recognition, the ability to tell the real from the rehearsed, changes who you let close, who you build with, who you choose to spend your time and energy on. Which brings us to something that works in the opposite direction entirely. Because now that you know how to protect yourself, how to read when something is off, it's time to talk about how to open something up, how to create the kind of connection that makes people feel genuinely seen and genuinely safe. Chapter 6. Mirror to connect. Instantly, Ethan ran into someone unexpected about 9 months into all of this. He was at an industry conference in the city, the kind of all-day event where you shake 40 hands and remember maybe 3 of them. He was getting coffee between sessions when he saw a woman standing alone near the window, looking out at the street below. Something about the way she was standing, slightly apart from everything, coffee cup held with both hands, made him walk over. He introduced himself. She told him her name was Claire. She was a senior director at a company he recognized. Quiet, measured, the kind of person who clearly didn't small talk easily. Most people would have found an excuse to move on within 2 minutes. Ethan stayed. He didn't perform. He didn't pitch himself. He didn't fill the silence with noise. He just listened. And when Claire spoke, he listened to the specific words she chose. Not the general idea, the actual words. She said the hardest part of her job was getting people aligned without forcing it. Ethan didn't paraphrase. He didn't translate. He said, aligned without forcing it? Yeah. How do you usually try to get there? Something shifted in her expression, not dramatically, just a small opening, like a window that had been stuck suddenly moving an inch. They talked for 40 minutes. By the end of it, Claire had offered to introduce him to 3 people in her network. Unprompted, because, she told him later in an email, she felt like he actually understood what she was dealing with. He hadn't solved anything for her. He hadn't given her advice. He had simply reflected her own language back to her with genuine attention. The deepest form of respect you can show another person is to use their own words like they matter. Because they do. Here's what most people do in conversation without realizing it. They listen just long enough to understand the general idea, and then they translate it. They reframe it in their own language. They respond to their version of what the other person said rather than what the other person actually said. This is natural. It's efficient. And it creates a subtle but persistent distance that most people feel without being able to name. When you reflect someone's exact language back to them, when you pick up the specific word or phrase they chose and use it in your response, something registers in them at a level below conscious thought. This person heard me, not the general outline of me. Me specifically. That's mirroring. And it goes further than just language. People have a pace. Some people think out loud, words arriving quickly, ideas building on each other in real time. Others process more slowly, pausing before they speak, choosing carefully, uncomfortable when the conversation moves faster than their thoughts. When you match someone's pace, when you don't rush a slow thinker or drag your feet with a fast one, they relax. The conversation stops feeling like something they have to manage and starts feeling like somewhere they can actually be. People have a volume. Some people are naturally expressive, hands moving, voice rising and falling, energy filling the space. Others are quieter, more contained, more comfortable with stillness. When you calibrate your own energy toward theirs, not perfectly, not artificially, just in the general direction, they feel met rather than overwhelmed or underwhelmed, and people have a posture. The way someone holds their body in a conversation is a kind of language too. When you naturally, without forcing it, begin to reflect elements of their posture, a similar lean, a similar degree of openness or stillness, something in them registers familiarity. And familiarity, for most human beings, is the beginning of trust. None of this should be mechanical. That's the thing that most people get wrong when they first learn about mirroring. They turn it into a technique, a set of moves to execute, and the moment it becomes mechanical, it becomes visible. And the moment it becomes visible, it becomes uncomfortable. The goal isn't to copy someone. The goal is to be present enough with them that some natural synchrony begins to happen on its own. To pay enough attention that your body and your language and your pace begin to move toward theirs, not because you're executing a strategy, but because you're genuinely, fully there. That's a different thing, and people feel the difference immediately. There's something else Ethan told me that has stayed with me. He said that when he started practicing this, really practicing it, not as a technique, but as a form of attention, he noticed something he hadn't expected. He started enjoying conversations more, not because they were going better for him strategically, though often they were, but because being that present with another person, that genuinely attentive to the specific texture of how they think and speak and move, made people interesting in a way they hadn't been before. He stopped seeing conversations as things to get through or perform well in. He started seeing them as the actual thing, as the point. And when you make another person the point, when your genuine interest is in them and not in how you're coming across to them, they feel it. You cannot fake that kind of attention, but you also cannot deploy it as a tactic and have it remain real. It has to come from actually caring, From being genuinely curious about the person in front of you. From believing in some real way that what they're carrying, what they've figured out, what they're struggling with, that it matters. When you bring that to a conversation, you don't need techniques. The mirroring happens naturally. The connection follows. Reflect wisely. Win their trust, not by being strategic, by being real. And here's something worth sitting with as we move into the next chapter. Everything we've talked about so far, reading the body, seeing past the mask, finding the need, understanding triggers, trusting your instincts, creating genuine connection, all of it happens between two people. But most of your life doesn't happen in one-on-one conversations. It happens in rooms, in groups, in meetings and dinners and gatherings, where the dynamics are invisible to most people but are running constantly underneath every exchange. Learning to read a room is a different skill, and it might be the one that changes everything about how you move through the world. Chapter 7. Read the status game in every room. Ethan told me about a meeting he sat in early on, before any of this had shifted for him, where he made a mistake so small that nobody commented on it. Nobody even seemed to notice. He walked in, grabbed the chair closest to the door because it was available, poured himself a coffee, and settled in. The meeting started. His manager's manager, a woman named Patricia, arrived 2 minutes late, looked briefly at the seating arrangement, and sat down without a word. But something in the room changed the moment she walked in. A slight adjustment, people straightening, conversations wrapping up a few seconds faster than they would have otherwise. Ethan presented his section of the agenda. It went fine, technically. His numbers were right, his points were clear. But afterward, a colleague pulled him aside and said quietly, "You were sitting in Patricia's chair." He hadn't known. Nobody had told him. There was no nameplate, no assigned seating, no rule written anywhere. But everyone in that room had known except him. That was the moment Ethan first understood that every room has an architecture, and most of it is completely invisible until you know how to look. Status isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's the quiet structure that organizes every room you walk into, whether anyone admits it or not. Here's what's worth understanding. Human beings are social animals. We have been for a very long time. And one of the things social animals do, inevitably, instinctively, without planning or deciding to, is organize themselves. Every group develops a hierarchy. Every room has people who hold more influence than others. Every conversation has someone whose opinion carries more weight than the words alone would suggest. This isn't cynical. It's just true. And pretending it isn't doesn't make you egalitarian. It just makes you less equipped to navigate reality. The people who move through rooms well, who consistently seem to land in the right conversations, build the right relationships, position themselves effectively without appearing to be positioning themselves at all. They're not necessarily smarter or more talented than everyone else. They've simply learned to read the invisible architecture before they start moving through it. So, what does that actually look like? Watch where people look when a difficult question gets asked. Not who answers it, who gets looked at. In every group, when something genuinely uncertain or complex lands in the room, people's eyes move, briefly, instinctively, toward whoever they trust most to handle it. That person might not be the most senior in the room. They might not be the loudest. But that moment of collective attention tells you something true about where the real influence lives. Notice who speaks last. In most groups, the person with the highest actual status, not necessarily the highest title, but the highest genuine influence, doesn't rush to fill silence. They let the conversation develop. They listen. And when they speak, they tend to speak less than you'd expect, and the room tends to go quieter than it does for anyone else. Pay attention to who other people position their bodies toward. Even in a large meeting, even when multiple conversations are happening, bodies tend to orient toward influence. People lean slightly in the direction of whoever holds weight in the room, often without knowing they're doing it. It's subtle, but once you see it everywhere. Watch how space gets used. Confidence, in physical terms, tends to take up room. Not aggressively, that's actually a sign of insecurity performing as confidence. but comfortably. The person who leans back in their chair and takes their time, who doesn't rush to fill silence with movement, who occupies their space without apology and without excess. That ease is almost always a signal of something real. And notice who defers to whom. Not in the obvious, formal ways, that's just hierarchy, but in the small moments, whose jokes land without effort, whose concerns get taken up by others and repeated as if they originated somewhere else, whose entrance subtly changes the energy of a room. Deference, in its quieter forms, is one of the most honest maps of influence you'll ever find. Ethan started arriving early to meetings after that. Not to network, not to get a good seat, but just to watch. 5 minutes of observation before the formal conversation started taught him more about the actual dynamics of a room than an hour of participation sometimes did. He started noticing things he'd walked past 100 times without registering. Who greeted Patricia directly, and who waited to be greeted. Who sat adjacent to her versus across from her. Whose comments she built on, and who she acknowledged and moved past. None of this made him calculating. That's important to say. He wasn't learning to manipulate the room. He was learning to stop being accidentally naive about how it worked. There's a difference between playing status games and understanding that status games exist. One makes you a worse person. The other makes you a more effective and honest one, because you stop operating on assumptions that were never true and start working with the reality that's actually in front of you. Every room has a structure. The question is whether you see it before you start moving through it, or only after you've already made a move you can't take back. What Ethan found, and this surprised him, he said, was that understanding the room made him less anxious in it. Not more strategic, less anxious. Because so much of the discomfort people feel in group settings comes from operating without information, from not understanding why something landed wrong, or why they feel invisible, or why the same points land differently depending on who says them. When you can see the architecture, the room stops being mysterious. It becomes readable, and readable things are navigable things. He also found something else, that the people with the most genuine influence, not the ones performing authority, but the ones who actually held it, were almost always the most attentive people in the room. They noticed things. They asked questions. They gave their full attention to whoever was speaking and made that person feel, briefly, like the most important person there. That quality, genuine, unhurried attention given freely, turned out to be not just a result of influence. It was a source of it, which is where everything we've covered starts to come together. Because reading a room, understanding the structure, knowing where the real weight lives, that's all preparation. It's the before. What matters just as much is the during. What you actually do once you're in the conversation, how you lead it, how you shape it, how you make sure that when it's over, something real happened. Every conversation is a negotiation. Not in the combative sense, in the sense that every exchange between human beings is shaping something, a relationship, a decision, a perception, an outcome. And the person who understands that truth and brings intention to it will almost always walk away with more than the person who simply showed up and hoped for the best. That intention, what it looks like, how to build it, and how to carry it into every conversation you have, is exactly what the final chapter is about. Chapter 8. Lead the interaction. Always. Ethan called me on a Tuesday evening about 18 months after that first quiet phone call. The one where he wasn't crying, just still. I remember where I was when he called this time too. Sitting in my car outside a grocery store, engine off, watching the parking lot lights flicker on as it got dark. He said, "I got the promotion." I said, "Tell me." And he did. But the thing is, the way he talked about it wasn't what I expected. He didn't talk about the deal he closed, or the numbers he hit, or the presentation that finally landed the way it should have. He talked about a conversation. A single conversation with Patricia, 3 weeks before the decision was announced. He said he walked into her office knowing exactly one thing. Not what he was going to say. Not how he was going to make his case. Just how he wanted her to feel when he left. He wanted her to feel like she'd just talked to someone she could trust with something that mattered. That was the whole intention. Everything else, the words, the examples, the way he listened, the moments he let breathe, all of it came from that one clear decision made before he sat down. Most people walk into important conversations hoping they go well. The ones who lead walk in knowing what well actually means. That's the difference. And it sounds small until you feel it from the other side of the table. Here's what leading an interaction actually is, and what it isn't. It isn't controlling the other person. It isn't steering the conversation toward an outcome you've predetermined, regardless of what they bring to it. It isn't a performance of confidence or a deployment of technique. It's intention. Clear, specific, honest intention about what you want this exchange to create. For both of you, before a conversation that matters, a difficult one, an important one where something real is at stake, ask yourself one question. Not, what do I need to say? Not, how do I make my case? Ask, how do I want this person to feel when we're done? Do you want them to feel heard? Then your job in that conversation is to listen more than you speak and to make sure, before you leave, that they know you understood them. Not just the words, but the weight behind the words. Do you want them to feel respected? Then you arrive prepared. You don't waste their time. You acknowledge what they bring to the table before you introduce what you bring. You treat the conversation as something that belongs to both of you, not just to your agenda. Do you want them to feel safe enough to be honest with you? Then you go first. You say the slightly uncomfortable thing before you ask them to. You model the kind of openness you're hoping to receive. You make the room safe by being the first one willing to be real in it. This is what Ethan had learned. Not as a formula. He was clear about that when he told me. As a practice. Something he brought to each conversation differently because each conversation called for something different. But the underlying intention was always there. Always set before he walked in. And there's something else he told me that I keep coming back to. He said the conversations he used to dread the most. The hard ones. The ones where something was wrong and it needed to be said. The ones with people who were difficult or closed off or defensive. Those conversations had gotten easier. Not because people had changed, because he had stopped walking into them reactively. He stopped walking in with his defense already up, his argument already rehearsed, his half of the conversation already decided. He started walking in open, genuinely curious about what he was going to find on the other side, willing to be changed by it. And when you walk in that way, when the other person can feel that you arrived without a verdict already in hand, something in them relaxes. Something that was braced for impact quietly stands down. And the conversation that was supposed to be hard becomes sometimes the most important one you've had in months. There are 3 things that consistently separate people who lead interactions from people who simply participate in them. The first is preparation that goes inward rather than outward. Most people prepare for difficult conversations by thinking about what they're going to say. The ones who lead prepare by getting clear on what they actually want. For themselves, for the other person, for the relationship. And then let that clarity guide the words as they come. The second is the ability to hold silence without filling it. Silence in a conversation is not a problem to solve. It's a space where the other person is allowed to think, to feel, to arrive at something real. The impulse to fill silence immediately is almost always about your own discomfort, not their need. Learning to sit in it, comfortably, openly, without pressure, is one of the most powerful things you can bring to any exchange. The third is ending with clarity. Not every conversation can end well. Some things are unresolved and need to stay that way for a while. But every conversation can end clearly. You can always say, before you leave, what you heard, what you understood, what happens next. Not as a summary, but as a gift. Because ambiguity after a hard conversation is its own kind of weight. And lifting it, even partially, is something only the person leading the interaction tends to think to do. Ethan got the promotion. But when I asked him what actually changed over those 18 months, he didn't talk about career outcomes. He talked about his friendships. He talked about a relationship with his father that had been strained for years and had quietly, slowly begun to repair itself. Not because of any dramatic conversation, but because Ethan had stopped waiting for his father to be different and had started showing up differently himself. He talked about feeling, for the first time in a long time, like the person he was becoming in his professional life and the person he was at home were starting to be the same person. That's what this skill ultimately does. Not just make you more effective in meetings, not just help you close deals or navigate difficult colleagues or read rooms accurately, it makes you more whole. Because when you learn to truly see people, to read what they're showing you without a word, to look past the performance to the person, to understand the need underneath the behavior, to recognize what's been hurt and what's been built and what's being carefully protected, you stop relating to people from a distance. You start meeting them where they actually are. And when you meet people where they actually are, consistently, genuinely, without agenda, something happens that no technique can manufacture. People trust you, not because you've earned it through strategy, because they can feel that you see them. And being truly seen is something most human beings spend their entire lives looking for. That's the real win. Not the promotion, not the closed deal, not the room you finally learn to read. The moment someone across from you relaxes, fully, quietly, completely, because they can feel that in your presence, they don't have to perform. That's what you're building toward. Walk in knowing, leave in control. Not control over other people, control over yourself, your intention, your attention, your ability to be fully present with whoever is in front of you, in whatever conversation is happening, in whatever room you find yourself in. That's the psychology of influence in its truest form. Not power over, presence with. And presence, real, unhurried, genuine presence, is the rarest and most powerful thing one human being can offer another. Ethan figured that out over 18 months, one conversation at a time. One moment of paying attention where he used to just react. One question asked where he used to just assume. You don't need 18 months, you just need the next conversation. There's a question I've been asked a few times since Ethan and I started talking about all of this. People hear a little of his story and they ask, is he naturally like that now? Does it just come to him automatically? The honest answer is no. Not automatically, not effortlessly. He still has conversations that go sideways. Rooms he misreads. Moments where he realizes halfway through that he walked in with his defenses up when he meant to walk in open. He's not a different person. He's a more aware version of who he already was. And that distinction matters. Because I think a lot of people hear a story like his and quietly place it in a category labeled "not me." They decide it's a gift some people have and others don't. And they use that thought to let themselves off the hook before they've even tried. What Ethan built wasn't talent. It was attention. Practiced, deliberately, consistently chosen attention. And attention is something every single one of us is capable of. You can learn to read the body before the words. You can learn to look past the mask and ask one more question. You can learn to find the need behind the behavior. To stop taking things personally that were never about you. You can learn to recognize triggers, to trust your instincts, to mirror genuinely, to read a room, and to walk into every conversation that matters with a clear intention instead of just a hope. None of this is fast. None of it is a hack. There is no version of genuine human understanding that comes without time, practice, and the occasional humbling moment where you had it completely wrong. But here's what I know for certain. The people who changed Ethan's life during those 18 months didn't change because he got better at reading them. They changed because they felt, maybe for the first time in that relationship, that someone was actually there with them. Fully there. That's what you're really building when you build this skill. Not a sharper eye, a fuller presence. So here's what I'm asking you to do, starting in the next 72 hours. Day 1. Give the body the same attention you give the words. Just notice what's happening beyond language. Day 2. With someone who has been frustrating you, ask why instead of what. Find the need underneath the behavior. Day 3. Before one conversation that matters, decide how you want the other person to feel when it's over. Let that guide everything else. 3 days, 3 small shifts, nothing dramatic, just a little more attention than yesterday. Understanding people isn't a gift, it's a choice, made every single day, to stay curious, to pay attention, and to treat every person in front of you as someone worth being truly seen. Ethan made that choice. You can too, and that's where everything begins.